Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order of the Racial Identity Profiling Advisory Board. I want to thank the Oakland Public Library for hosting this event and appreciate all of you being here today. Today we have the distinct pleasure of having our Attorney General here. So we are going to take the agenda slightly out of order to allow him an opportunity to hear from some members of the public before he speaks. First off, we have first order of business for the board is approval of the July 12th, 2017 meeting minutes. So I'll need a motion to approve those. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Anyone opposed? Are there any abstentions? The motion carries. Next, at this point, we're going to allow about 5 members of the public. Okay, so, sorry about that. We're going to have the Attorney General, Javier Becerra, give his comments first, and then following that, we're going to allow about 5 members of the public to make comments. The comments will be limited to 2 minutes before the Attorney General has to leave. So, Attorney General?
Chief Medrano and Reverend McBride, and to all the members of the RIPA board, I just want to say thank you very much for the work that you have done over these last several months in trying to help California get to a point where we can give all of our 40 million people, and certainly the people who are interested in public safety day in, day out, whether it's our law enforcement officials or whether it's the folks who have families who want to make sure that their kids and loved ones are safe. We want to say thank you to you all for the work that you did in helping us get to this point. I think it's important to announce to you today that as of early this week, the Department of Justice has submitted the regulations that you helped us produce to the Office of Administrative Law, and we believe that by early November, we should be up and running with RIPA regulations that will allow us to now move forward in addressing the issues of racial and identity profiling here in the state of California. So thank you to what you have done. Thank you all very much. And Nate, that's right. It's appropriate to give them a round of applause. I am looking forward to hearing some of the testimony. I cannot stay very long, but I did want to come because it's a monumental occasion when you can say all this effort has produced something. And I will say to you, and I think each and every member of this board would attest to this, we really went through this. We scrubbed it. We gave it a great deal of attention. We heard from many people. We heard from folks of goodwill from all the different communities, the stakeholders, and the product I believe that we have before us today in these regulations is a testament to what people of goodwill can produce. I will say to you that having grown up as a young man and having been stopped myself, having visited with our men and women in uniform on a daily basis who have to do very tough assignments, having sat down with family members of individuals who have lost their lives, this is too important not to get it right. And we have an opportunity, I think, to build what's perhaps the most important thing in dealing with public safety, and that is trust. Giving all of us the sense that we're doing this together. There's no way you do public safety without a team effort, and it takes all of us working together to make sure that we make our communities and our families feel safe. And so I simply want to say to those of you who have worked very hard, to the public that has taken the time to come out and provide comment, thank you. And I hope that what we can do now with these regulations and working with everyone you see on this board, everyone in law enforcement, and certainly all our community members, what we can say is that we now have an opportunity to try to get to the point where when it comes to our law enforcement contact with the public, that there can be trust, that we're doing this all as a team in the best interest, not just of the people of the state of California, but of creating that sense of real public safety for all. And so I'm pleased to be here. Look forward to the comments. Mr. Chairman, and to all the members of the RIPA board, congratulations on your work. Let's move forward together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. We appreciate your support, and I just, on behalf of the board, this certainly has been a partnership, and I just want to acknowledge all of the great work of all the members of your staff who have helped this board come together and get a lot of things accomplished. So they've done a great job. At this point, we are going to allow about 5 speakers to address the board. We'll give you each about 2 minutes. This, by no means, is not your only opportunity to speak. We will be having a second round of public comments, but if you are interested at this point making some public comments while the Attorney General is here, this is your opportunity. There is a microphone in the back, and we will let you know when your time is up. So if there's any speakers that would like to speak now, please move forward.
Good morning. I'm Rosa Akil with Policy Link and the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. Thank you for having this meeting here in West Oakland today. It's much appreciated. Just a couple of points. Do I sound strange? I hear this weird echo. It doesn't sound weird? Okay. Just me. So first, I do want to echo the Attorney General's comments related to the staff. The team that's been working on implementation for quite a while now has really been incredible. And so many, many thanks to Shannon, to Nancy, and to Kelly, and to just all of you that have been so incredibly helpful in being such good partners. So thank you for all of your tremendous work. In terms of the regulations, we're also very excited that this process is coming to a close. And again, just want to reiterate a couple of the points that we had discussed in a couple of the subcommittees over the past several weeks. One particularly as it relates to the inclusion of qualitative data. Clearly, this is legislation that has to do with quantitative data, and we need the data for many, many reasons. But I want to just continue to make the pitch for why it's necessary to continually include the qualitative data. This legislation was about people, right? So data is irrelevant unless it's connected to the peoples whose lives are connected to that information. And so including the testimony of so many folks that over the last year and a half have come to this body to share their stories, their interactions with police violence, with the loss of their loved ones as a result of police violence, I think is really critical. It's important to show why we're doing this in the first place and why having that kind of data is so important. One of the things that I hope we never lose sight of is what the genesis was for this legislation in the first place, which folks remember in 2014, Michael Brown was killed, and that really catalyzed an entire movement, a movement that has continued and has an ongoing battle to make Black Lives Matter. That has not stopped. And unfortunately, Black lives still do not matter, and police violence continues to take the lives of Black folks with impunity and other folks of color. And so I just want to make sure that we don't forget that this is not just about data, that this is about people, that this is about making Black lives matter, and ultimately making sure that communities of color are being safe, in that they're not being further criminalized and further endangered by the police in their communities.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Diana Tate Vermeer. I'm from the ACLU of California. I want to second Rosa's thoughts and thanks and appreciation both to the AG for being here today, for the RIPA board and all of its tremendous work, and all of the work of the DOJ staff and AG's office to get this statute implemented strongly, and with the promise that it gives us of improving policing and trust in the community. I would encourage other folks to take the few moments that we have now to speak, but the one thing that I want to also highlight is we're moving into the next phase of implementation. We're talking about the first report issued by the RIPA board, and I'm hopeful that we remain focused on improving the trust between law enforcement and the communities that it serves. And by doing that, we're looking at policies and procedures, we're looking at practices, we're looking at trainings, and we're looking at the solutions to a complex and difficult problem. We all care about public safety. We need to understand what that means and ensure that the communities being policed are safe in and of themselves. Thank you all for your time and your commitment to these issues, and we look forward to continuing this work together.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers?
Good morning, Board. My name is Kaylin Dean, and I'm from San Diego today. Today is actually the one-year anniversary for Alfred Alongo, and I'm not sure if everyone in this room is familiar with what that case was, but it was an officer-involved shooting of a black male who was shot and had mental illness. And his family called the officers to the scene, and what ended up being a vape or an electronic cigarette was what the officers thought he had to be a gun. And so he lost his life at a young age, and while the nuances of that case are still being discussed, I think it's important here to lift up and to say his name in this space, as today is the one-year anniversary of his shooting. I want to thank the board for taking the time to recognize and hear public comment and public testimony. As someone who has been a part of all of the board meetings and the subcommittee meetings that have just happened over the last week or two, I thank you because you guys have agreed that public testimony is probably the most compelling parts to these meetings. And so I want to invite you, in the absence of any data collected, as we're working towards getting the data collected, please continue to include this type of data. I echo what Rosa said about getting this type of written data and the written testimonies to be included in your reports. I think that's going to be incredibly crucial as we move forward in this process. So I also ask that you hold yourselves to a high standard right now as we move forward into the next year, and continue to allow public comment to be a part of these meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak at this time? Okay, great. Thank you. Next, we're going to move on to an update from the Department of Justice.
Good morning. As the Attorney General mentioned, the regulations have been sent to the Office of Administrative Law. That was done yesterday. Hopefully, everything will go smoothly and we will have a final product, at least filed with the Secretary of State in November. I don't want to get too technical, but we have requested that the regulations be effective upon filing. But we don't know if OAL will grant that request. If that's not granted, the regulations will be effective as of January 1st, but they will be finalized in any event. And so, as Jenny will speak in a second about what CJIS is doing in terms of their next steps, they will be final for purposes of planning and going forward. So, as you guys all recall, there was a 45-day public comment period. There was followed by a 15-day public comment period. We have synthesized every single comment that has come in to our office, and the product is virtually the same as what we posted for our 15-day public comment period, absent a few typographical errors. I want to also give you a slight another update about AB 1518 that has been enrolled and sent to the governor's desk for his approval. Hopefully he will. The Attorney General has sent a letter to the governor asking him to approve. And if you don't remember what AB 1518 is, they are additional amendments to the Racial Identity Profiling Act itself. And what they would do would be to start data collection for agencies that employ over 1,000 peace officers on July 1st, 2018, as opposed to January 1st, 2018. And as I mentioned in the last meeting, that was done simply so that the systems could get up in place and the data collection could have a system to actually be collected. Nothing will change with regard to the time period in which any law enforcement agency will have to report that data to the Department of Justice. Those schedules were never changed, so the first wave of reports will still come into the Attorney General's office in April of 2019, as originally planned in the statute. This law, the changes to the law also clarify that the data reported shall be available to the public except for badge number or unique identifying information of the peace officer, and it makes law enforcement agencies responsible for ensuring that any personally identifiable information of the individual stopped is exempt from disclosure is not transmitted to the Attorney General in any of the open text fields. So we are doing that to make that the information available publicly, and also to ensure that information is not wrongly provided to our office and then inadvertently posted. So those are really the big pieces. I know you all have been working really hard on the next phase of your work in the report with Shannon, but I just want to step back for 1 second, and I'm going to cry because I am so proud of my team. Catherine Israel took this act and she put it into a regulatory format, and I'm amazed. She did that. Catherine, stand up. Catherine. But just, can you please stand? And Kathy Rades, Shannon Hovis, Jenny Rich, Randy Chance, all worked tirelessly to get what we have as the final product. And I'm so proud of everybody's work. I really am. Thank you all so much. And I think Jenny would like to provide a little update about the technical pieces, because I know law enforcement in particular will be interested.
Is this already on? Looks like I made it just in time, huh? So our Department of Justice, the California Justice Information Services Division, is working on the technology aspects of being able to collect this stop data. And we are in the process of developing a web application that will allow agencies to easily collect this data and then submit it to our department. Our next phase is going to include outreach again with the first and second wave of agencies that have to begin reporting this data to our department in July of 2018, right? Is when they
19.
No, they start collecting
they
in
start
2018. Yes. So that outreach is going to happen in the next couple of weeks. We are going to again be reaching out to the first 9 wave agencies that will begin reporting, and then we're also going to include the second wave of reporting agencies. And we're going to be meeting with those agencies to start talking about the data dictionary and then how they will have to build out their record management collection systems in order to submit that data to us. And we also, in the next couple of weeks, are going to be holding a meeting with the vendors that work with the different law enforcement agencies to get them on board with the collection data dictionary and schemas and whatnot. That's pretty much it from.
All right, thank you to the Department of Justice for that update. Just want to open it up for a quick round of questions from board members on the update. I think it's on now.
Is it on? Okay, great. Thank you for being here, Attorney General. Really helpful. And while you're here, we have the pleasure of having Angela and Kelly and others here. Just wanted to maybe ask a 2-part question for you and your staff on the bigger picture. I think we're all really gratified that accurate data is going to start to come in. Of course, it's going to be a little time, but we'll be digging our heels in and rolling up our sleeves to see what else we can help to move in the meantime. But in this time of a sharp turn in terms of federal policy and clearly stated antipathy and hostility from our U.S. Attorney General towards pattern practice investigations and some of the settlements that had already been reached, et cetera, would love the department's perspective, your perspective, on 2 things. One, what does that mean for the Attorney General's office in California? I think we all are hopeful that policy change and data and best practices is going to really lend significant momentum towards change. But we also know there are departments that are deeply, deeply troubled. So what does that mean in that context? And then any thoughts that you or staff have, I think, for us in this, in a sense, interim period pre-data, but sort of taking the broader challenge of AB 953, which actually tells us we are supposed to be ending racial and identity profiling, where you all think we best put our energies and our efforts as we look towards that very ambitious challenge.
I think you can hear. Okay, here we go. I think Tim, the folks who have been working this within DOJ can probably give you a deeper dive on this. But I would simply tell you this: we're not going to stop doing what we're doing in California because of the dysfunction in Washington D.C. We'll keep doing what we think is appropriate to build up trust. And to provide that public safety with all the stakeholders who want to participate. This action, this effort under AB 953 is just about one way that we get all the stakeholders to come together. I think the regs are a great testament to the work that was done to come up with something that we can now actually work on the ground. It was not easy, as you know. And so now it's a test of all of our effort to try to actually make this work. I would encourage communities, especially in the jurisdictions where these 9 agencies now must move forward, to work closely with their law enforcement offices, because it is not going to be easy altogether. We're trying to make the applications as easy to use as possible, because we don't want this to become a major expense for any law enforcement agency, because more money that's used and time that's used to do the RIPA application is time taken away from other very important law enforcement activity, and it's all critical. So we have to figure out how it all meshes in together. So we're going to continue doing what we're doing. The Department of Justice will continue its oversight of law enforcement throughout the state of California. And I think between now and the time we start to collect the data that gives us a chance to make good assessments, what we're going to continue to do is work with all the principals in law enforcement who have been just, I think, phenomenal in reaching out to try to work the Department of Justice to give us their best sense of how to make this work, and to all the community that's been so constructive in its critique. I won't say criticism, in its critique of what we have to do, because that's, as someone said earlier, sometimes the best information comes out of the public comment. So we'll continue to collect that and work together, and I think we're going to see that as we move forward. The RIPA regs will be adapted to make sure they're working for everyone, especially as we bring in each successive wave of law enforcement agencies to participate in the data collection.
If you could hold on to that mic, brother, Attorney General, one follow-up question. One of the critiques of the RIPA board that we've heard thus far over, I want to say, the year and some change that we've been meeting has been that this board has no teeth, and that it simply is going to be making recommendations. And I think we just did at our last meeting that we wanted to figure out how to have the sharpest gums possible on this board to ensure that the work that's happening here is actually contributing to, effective freedom and liberation for people that are most at risk. What assurances can you give the public about how the data that is captured and the recommendations that are made to your office from this board, that they will be effectively implemented? I think that the power of this board to make recommendations is only as powerful as the commitment from both your leadership and the Department of Justice to implement those recommendations. Can you speak to kind of your theory of change, your thought process around that?
Yeah. Well, first, Reverend, I think no one would accuse you of wearing dentures, so I think we know that there are people who will keep us to task in the Department of Justice and keep all the stakeholders who have to make these new regs and the enforcement activities on the stops work. This board is the body, the go-to body for the Department of Justice when it comes to RIPA. It will be the body that we continue to use to guide us, to give us the input, because I don't have the ability or the resources to be able to set up something like this on my own without the experts that you see sitting in this board. And so I would hope that every board member would recognize that their job has not ended with the publishing of the regs. It has just begun. And we hope that you'll continue to be partners with the Department of Justice as we try to make sure that we're collecting the right data and then that we're massaging everything to make it work the right way. Because as I said before, you know, when you first put up something to fly, you have no idea how high it's going to be able to go. And I think we all want to see this work well. And so I have no doubt that in the future, how near, I can't say, in the next year or two or so, once we have data, we're going to probably need to start making tweaks. And this is where the board's work, ongoing work, will be essential to be able to know how to refine this law to make it work for everyone.
Any other questions for the AG or Department of Justice before he has to exit? I'm aware of his time constraints, but we just wanted to open that back up to any more questions from board members.
Thank you again for coming to our board meeting today. It's been a pleasure listening to you. As Attorney General of this state, one of the more powerful states in the Union, you have immense power, and one of the powers you have is that of a bully pulpit, not just on a statewide basis, but nationally, and you use it well. I would like to ask that you consider that that particular power could be used to make the point that notwithstanding the law enforcement focus of this board and part of your office, it's important that people understand that the system is unequal and that we are very limited in what we can do to change law enforcement practices within an unequal system. And I think that perhaps the more Americans and Californians who understand that, perhaps the easier it will be to do our job.
Judge, I'll simply comment to say that for the first time, we're going to actually have data that can back up what we're trying to do. And that's perhaps the most important thing, because when you have contentious issues, when you sometimes have disagreement about where we are and where we need to go, sometimes there's some clarity that's added when you have actual data that can help you, because as much as the comment was made earlier about the quality of information, if you don't have enough of it, it's hard to make decisions or get people to agree. And as I said, this has to be a team effort. And I think the more we collect data that backs up where we want to go, it'll be a lot easier to have a powerful voice on that bully pulpit to direct not just California, but the rest of the nation. By the way, we are the most powerful state in the nation. Mr. Chairman, I probably need to run.
All right, we want to appreciate Attorney General for being here with us. Thank you. So now I believe we can shift. We opened it up for some earlier public comment before the Attorney General to just create some narrative and conversation for him to interact with before he had to leave. We do have a few minutes still available in our agenda to open it up after we've had now some questions from the board to the Department of Justice for our last small period of public comment before our first break. So we're able to open it up for another 4 to 5 speakers if there are those that would want to participate with public comment at this time.
We still need to approve the minutes. And,
We did.
oh,
First
You-
thing I did.
you did? Okay, I need to swear in Commissioner Stanley because
Okay.
he has not yet been sworn in. Okay, I'm
All
sorry, I missed the approval of the minutes. You have to say yes. You have to repeat yourself. I, Warren Stanley,
I, Warren Stanley,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly
that
swear
I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state of state of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California,
to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of California,
that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation
that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
and that I will well and faithfully, can you repeat that last?
Discharge
The duties
upon which I am about to enter.
upon which I am about to enter.
Congratulations,
Thank
you're
you.
officially a RIPA board member.
All right, thank you very much. Opening it back up for a few minutes or an opportunity for public comment before we switch back to board updates and discussion. You can go, if you have public comment, you can just make your way back to that microphone in the rear of the room.
Hi, hello. Hi, how you doing? My name is Jabari Holder. I'm here. I work with Live Free. I've been going all across the state, a little bit out the country, trying to do this work to try to bridge the gap between community and law enforcement the best way I can as an individual with the team that I work with. I'm hearing a lot of excuses, man. I mean, it's people out here dying, man, on a day-to-day basis, man. I'm black. I work every day. I'm a model citizen. I have made mistakes in my life. I'd be afraid of the same people that's supposed to protect me, and that's sad. And I think that should be mentioned here at this RIPA board meeting. It shouldn't be people of color scared of the same people that's trying to protect them. Like, it's a fear. It's a lot of stuff that I feel that law enforcement needs to do to give the people in the community a little bit of recovery, if you can call it. Like, people are damaged. People are heartbroken. People are feared. It's all over social media, and it's happening in real life. Like, people are scared of the same people that are supposed to protect them. And I just want to say, like, I don't have no excuses when I wake up in the morning to try to help the people that I do care about. And those are the people that are from them streets. Them same people that get arrested, the same people that you say that you are scared of. I care for them people dearly, and because I realize that they're nothing but human beings. They're the same little kids that we saw that said they were cute kids. They're the same kids that we looked at Sunday school. They're the same kids that we watched go to school every morning. I'm from Oakland, born and raised. I love Oakland to death, and I know my people can do better if they get the right opportunity. But we don't need no roadblocks distracting us from getting ourselves together. It's possible. Just work with us and try to get us together. Thank you.
My name is Jesus Ruiz, and I'm from San Jose. And I'm here, like my brother right here, because I'm a brown man. I'm a young brown man, and I've seen what has happened to people that look like me. I'm from San Jose, and we have 8 involved police shooting, killing this year. And the recent one is from Jacob Dominguez, who was shot a few weeks ago, and he was unarmed. And I went to an event on Monday. And what a family member was saying is that she tells her kids not to call the cops when there's an emergency. She tells them, call your uncle, call our pastor, call somebody else, but don't call the cops, because we don't want them to look at you and think that you may be the one that's breaking the law. And I just keep hearing all the time saying, they didn't comply. Well, I'm just wondering at what point did protect themselves become comply or die?
Hi, my name is Samina Usman. I'm the Government Relations Coordinator for the Council on American Islamic Relations. And what we do is that we provide free legal services to people experiencing any discrimination or hate crimes. And as you can imagine, we've been experiencing it, the Muslim community has been experiencing it on an increased level ever since especially since the election. Now, a lot of people within the community are very concerned about the people who we're supposed to be going to when we're supposed to be reaching out for help. Now, there's a discussion is, should we even be approaching police when it comes to, situations of if, people have been facing any hate crimes or facing any, whatever issues in the community. Now, we shouldn't be having that fear of reaching those who are supposed to be there to protect us. And this is something, I'm very thankful that we do have AB 953, that it did pass, and we want to make sure, as Reverend McBride said, that we want to make sure that it does have some teeth, that the committee has some teeth, and that we implement whatever data that we discover, that we're able to implement that when it comes to coming up with whatever legislation or whatever policies that will be coming, thus forth. And so, I think we really do need to, value the information that we have and make sure that there is that there are going to be some meaningful changes that will come about because of the data that is collected. But, and just one thing to add though. So I know AB 953, it deals with racial profiling. Now, and I know that originally there was a religious component as well that was added, and then it was removed. And I do understand, maybe the reasoning for why it was removed, because again, one's religious affiliation is, that's definitely something private. You can't really tell based on one's appearance, because you could be a Caucasian and you could be from, a Muslim faith or whatever other faith. So, I'm just, this is like an open question, and I don't even know if there is an answer to this, but how do we kind of gather whatever data about any religious profiling that's been happening? And I know we're definitely seeing that at the airports, and obviously this legislation does not cover the airports, it covers, with law enforcement, but I think that might be something that we may need to think about going forward. So, thank you.
Hello. My name is Terrence Stewart. I'm a community organizer with Inland Congregation United for Change. We operate under the framework of HEAT, which is hiring, equipment, accountability, and training. And that's the focus that we focus on when it comes to police accountability. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was like why we need this RIPA board to be work really well is to keep our community safe. I talk about this story, but it happened to me was one time when I was walking down the street, I seen this guy, and he had fell out and he was turning blue. And what happened was I called the police, or I called 911. It wasn't the police exactly, and to get him help. And when the police came, they came and they harassed me for being there. They asked me what was I doing in that community, how did I know this guy, what was I doing with him, and they treated me as if I was a criminal. And like, the overarching thing about that is that if I see somebody else turning blue, I would question to call the police anymore, because I'd be afraid of me being at risk. So like, one of the things is about this is that it's trying to keep the community safe, because now I am that much more hesitant to help the next person, and like that goes on across the board and many other people. So like, like racial profiling and all this other stuff, it creates a distrust in the community, and with that distrust, it makes it that much not safe for the whole community, and like, I just feel like, y'all should take the people personal accounts and listen to the stories that they're talking about and add this to the DOJ original reports, because I've been hearing there's been pushback, but y'all don't want to listen to our stories, but these ain't stories, these are our lives. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Greg Jones. I'm an organizer with Inland Congregations United for Change, a part of Pico, California, and I'm a community organizer as well. Last night we had a group meeting about the implementation of Prop 64, and one of the things that came up is a lot of times when people were getting pulled over for a marijuana arrest, or just being inquired by the police as to what they're doing, stop, search or whatever, and there was found marijuana on them. A lot of times it didn't get recorded as a fine, or you don't get a ticket or a court date. You just get it taken away from you. And the questions come up as what happens to it when it gets taken away? Like, do you take it into evidence? Do you destroy it? You know, when you take money that you suspect is, you know, from part of a crime, like, does it get recorded? There's no data as far as what happens with that. So, you know, I was thinking about AB 953, how, you know, the people are pushing for there to be more accountability as far as recording your encounters with the citizens. And it kind of dawned on me, like, it is very important that we do have that, because what does happen when you guys, you know, take those possessions from people? Like, what do you do with it? I think the community has a right to know, because we're tax-paying citizens, and we want transparency with how the police operate. The less transparency there is, the more valid, reasonable fear that, you know, the police are going to be, you know, they're going to do something that is not in the best interest of the people. And, you know, I believe that the police here are in the best interest of the people, and they don't want people to be afraid of them. So I would hope that you would want more transparency to keep you all safer, and that we know what you guys are doing, and that, you know, we have the strongest relationship and the best relationship between the citizens and the police. And we're here to help you guys to establish that any way we can. Thank you.
My name is Alice Lynch. I'm a member of People Acting in Community Together, which is a PICO federation in San Jose, California. We're doing a lot of work on increasing transparency and accountability in our San Jose Police Department. And I just want to emphasize the urgency of making the move forward with all this work that AB 953 is in the process of implementing, that there's no time to slow down. Basically, one of my friends and fellow organizers and fellow congregants in my First Unitarian Church of San Jose, a black man in his 40s, a few weeks ago was sitting in his car in a parking lot in Campbell, California at Fry's, reading a book, and a Campbell police officer came over to his car and started behaving in a threatening manner toward him, because he looked like someone that had stolen something. And of course, my friend was terrified and was trying to do whatever he could to convince the officer that it was not him. He thought that he was being accused of stealing the book that he was reading, and the receipt for it was in the trunk of his car, so he started to go for his keys in his pocket, and he saw the officer go for his gun. Luckily, nothing happened as far as physically him being harmed, but of course the trauma is something that lives on. I mean, he had experiences like this before, but this was one of the most traumatizing experiences that he's had. So again, I just want to emphasize we need to move forward as quickly as we can with gathering this data and figuring out how to create a safe environment where everyone can trust the police.
Continue to thank the public for coming in and bringing you all stories and your messages. I think it's critically important for our work on the board to be hearing these stories in the public comments so we can integrate that into our work. So again, I think I speak on behalf of everyone here on the board. Extreme gratitude for the community and the public coming in and sharing that with us. Now we're going to transition over to our subcommittee reports. For those that were at the last board meeting, you would remember that we separated ourselves into 5 subcommittee groups that since have met, I believe, since our last board meeting. I believe all 5 groups have met. And so we do have, you'll find in your folders, the minutes of those subcommittees. So I believe we want to take kind of an opportunity and have the subcommittee chairs, one of the chairs, kind of give us an update on what the discussion was in you all's subcommittees. so that we can kind of raise some consciousness for all the rest of the board members and subsequently some conversation around what's happening. Is there any addition from DOJ?
Yeah, let me just clarify that you only have the subcommittee minutes for the subcommittees on which you sit within your folder. So the first thing we should do when we provide, we were finishing them at like 6 o'clock this morning. So the first thing we should do is actually have each subcommittee approve that set of subcommittee minutes as you go through the process.
It would be really helpful, I think, I know what happened in the subcommittees that I participated in. It'd be really helpful to have the minutes from the other subcommittees as opposed to just our own.
We will have them in the future. Whoa, that microphone does not like me. They'll also be posted on our website as soon as the meeting's over.
Committees just be sent around or sent out to the members of this body. I mean, it would be helpful to see them quicker than later.
So just a clarifying question for Board Member Johnson. Are you asking if the minutes can actually be provided while we're here?
Well, no,
Or
if they're
just-
provided while they're here, or if they're provided, in the next couple of days, it'd be helpful not to wait until the next meeting to see those minutes.
Yeah, they'll be posted on our website as soon as the meeting ends. I'll make sure they're posted.
I think the problem was is they hadn't been approved yet, and so that was why Shannon was doing it that way, so that the individual committee members could just see the minutes that they had, approve those, and then the discussion could focus on the other aspects as the subcommittee co-chairs. But everyone in their brother can have every subcommittee minute that they want, so do not worry, they will be on the way.
And one of the last subcommittees just had a meeting yesterday and didn't end until about 3, so there wasn't a lot of time.
Well, maybe we can start with the Stop Data Subcommittee. I think they'll both we'll toss it over to Board Member Oden, and maybe you can give us a review, and then also we'll be able to approve your minutes.
Okay, good morning. The Stop Committee, Subcommittee met, and the goal of the subcommittee is to identify with comparison data what we wanted to use to begin to source the information. In other words, when you have data, it doesn't do you any good if the data is not collected and it's not relevant. So one of the things we wanted to do was to look at other reports of stop data that's been done in California to give us a feel for what were basically the best practices and compare because every different report emphasized different areas. We reviewed reports from the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement, studies from academia to determine, look at their reports so that when we get together and come up with stop data that it is relevant. So that was one of the things that we wanted to focus on. Number one, to look at other reports so that we don't spend time and effort doing something that's already been produced. And some of the cities have also collected data in the past. So we wanted to make sure that we had that as we go forward. One of the things we also wanted to do was to create a baseline. In other words, what is the current state of racial profiling and identity profiling so that when you collect the data, can you determine whether or not things are improving, staying the same, or getting worse? So that's one of the things we're trying to ascertain is what is the baseline? What is the status quo so that when as the data comes in, how can we then compare that to the status quo to see how things are projecting? So those are some of the things that our particular subcommittee was looking at. And we're also looking at in terms of collecting the data to make sure that we're taking into account certain factors such as the residential population of where the data is collected at. In other words, so if you're in a very rural area and there's one or two stops, how does that compare with an urban area where there's multiple stops? So, you have to take that into consideration when you talk about qualitative results, because, if the data is no good, your conclusions can be wrong based on the fact that you collected the data in the wrong way. We also wanted to look at the driving age of those who are stopped. Certainly there may be differences in the terms of racial identity where a older person, if the majority of stops are within a certain demographic range, let's say 18 to 35, and it shows, we want to be able to show that as opposed to looping that in with folks who are 70 years old getting stopped, because it might be a different reason. There may be, officers may have a reason to think that a younger person might be associated with wrongdoing as opposed to an elderly person. So we wanted to put that into the qualitative results. What's the population, the daytime population? Sometimes there are more people out during the day than at night. How does that fit into who gets stopped, when they get stopped, and why they got stopped? We're looking at that. We're looking at also when these individuals get stopped, what's the percentage of those who were stopped who've had frequent law enforcement contact, such as they were on probation, on parole. How does that fit in? Are there more people being stopped because of their probation status or their parole status versus other factors? And we're also looking at, how the stops, were there traffic stops, were there stops that may have resulted from a car accident, trying to find the difference between those type of stops and other stops where a person gets stopped based on a hunch. So we want to make sure that when we collect the data, that the data has relevance. And finally, in terms of looking at the stops, what was the crime rate in the area where the stops took place? Is it a high crime area? Is it a lower crime area? How does that figure in as to who gets stopped, why they get stopped? So those are some of the things that this subcommittee is looking at. Ed, do you have any further comments?
Just a couple. One of the interesting things that we talked about is how we build in contextual data to assist us to analyze this. And I thought it was interesting that we're not only looking at typical census data, population data, and other things, but we actually are looking at what other non-traditional, non-related law enforcement organizations look at in terms of trying to define who's in what communities, such as information from the Department of Finance, maybe school districts, other things, so we can get a real true picture of what the populations within each of our communities look like. Because as we know, some of them have very diverse swings in terms of population, daytime, nighttime events, destination cities not, a lot of things. So if we can use as many different sources to try to put the most accurate expression of what that community looks like, it'd be helpful in us being able to analyze the data.
Did we need to approve the report?
Any other questions from any board members for the committee?
I just had a chance to skim your minutes very quickly, but it sounds like you had an interesting conversation about the scope of what was to be included in terms of conversation about AB 71 and whether the use of force subsequent to a stop was to be included in the scope. But I wasn't clear from quickly skimming these minutes whether you all came to a conclusion and a decision around that issue.
And there was no conclusion that was reached. I mean, we're looking at different data sources that are currently available as opposed to data sources that, it's going to be a while before the RIPA data comes in. So we're just kind of tossing the idea about, is there anything that we can draw from that data just as a starting point to look at how we evaluate future data collection efforts.
Well, I guess I would weigh in on the side, as I see it in this conversation, that while we are starting with analysis, and obviously what we can do now depends on what data is out there, but that I don't think it's the intent, in my mind, to simply look at racial and identity profiling at the moment of a stop, right? And I think that the data that we all worked hard on establishing and collecting through the RIPA process is clearly inclusive of what happens after a stop. So to the extent that there is data about whether it's use of force or other, I mean, we have a raft of other things that we are requesting data about in terms of the results of stops, not just the stop itself. So to the extent that there is data out there, I would encourage the committee to include it, the subcommittee.
All right. Can we have someone put forth a motion to approve the minutes as read? Or is there? Okay. Can we have a motion? Someone second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, motion so carried. Department of Justice.
So I just wanted to add, I guess, one of the pieces that this subcommittee discussed is framing of this problem and really the purpose of the board. This is the board's first report. And so this provides an opportunity for us to really set the stage for what this report will accomplish every year and what the members of this board, really view as the scope of the work of the board. So we'd also talked about how to highlight different, essentially what the problem is and what we're doing to solve it and what our vision is for this. So I just wanted to add that was a more macro picture that we've talked about in a few different committees, but it's something to consider. Certainly the beginning of the report will want to lay out a very clear framing of where we are and what our intentions are and all of that. So just wanted to add that. And I don't know if Randy, do you want to?
So I can just address the comment about the data collection and examining data, both sort of the reason for somebody getting pulled over or stopped versus the post-stop action. So we absolutely know that we will definitely break out the data analysis in such a way that we would be looking at both of those things. The data that we've talked about going out and collecting this sort of contextual picture is sort of help to provide us a better picture about the realm of who can be stopped in these various locations at the various times that we see stopped, so that we can compare the data we actually get to determine whether or not there are disparities. If we don't have that contextual data, we won't know what the data we've collected necessarily means on the first part of that question, the when people are stopped. The post-stop actions are something we're going to have to look further into. I would also say that our subcommittee is made up of just a small number of folks. So if there are others who have other data sources that they are familiar with and they suggest that we look into, we're happy to field those suggestions as well.
All right. Well, we'll move forward over to our next subcommittee report. As stated earlier, we do not have minutes for several of our subcommittee meetings for a variety of different reasons. So we don't have in front of us who the actual chairs are for the Citizens Complaints Committee. I'm aware you know who you are. All right. So why don't we toss it over to Board Member Robinson and maybe whoever else is part of that, maybe give us a review of some notes from you all's committee.
And Reverend, I actually have a couple of extras that I will distribute and you can share.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Sahar is unable to be here, so I get to present for this subcommittee. It's the Citizens Complaint Subcommittee, and I have some notes on my computer as well that I'll be referencing. And so one of the things that we talked about in this subcommittee was just trying to delve down into what each agency actually does, because while you're required as a law enforcement agency to take in a complaint and have a complaint process, we were concerned that there wasn't any uniform complaint process throughout the state of California that people could refer to. And so we talked a lot about trying to figure out, especially those 8 or 9 agencies that are coming online first, to find out what they do, so we can include that in the report, but we also wanted to expand that to perhaps the Department of Justice zone regions to see what other agencies do in those regions throughout the state of California. And furthermore, to actually find out what each agency in the state of California does. And so that lent to a discussion going into sending out a survey to each law enforcement agency, which is in the board members' packets, that has some basic questions on complaints and policies, et cetera, that will go out to each law enforcement agency. We wanted to make sure that we covered, the good and the bad. In the RIPA, there's been a lot of talk about what agencies aren't doing right, but we also wanted to make sure we talk about what some agencies are doing right. And so if there's agencies out there that have those best practices that other agencies can pick up on, we wanted to make sure that that was included in the report, and thus the survey going out to all the other law enforcement agencies. Also in the subcommittee, we talked about which agencies had the least amount of complaints and which agencies had the most amount of complaints. And that is data that is already available through the Department of Justice website. But we talked about making sure we gave that some context. So if you had a small agency that had a small number of complaints, or a large agency that had a large number of complaints, how does that reference into the population and perhaps a per capita ratio? And how does it also reference into the number of calls for service that those agencies are actually handling? So that way you can put it in a context of the number of stops and the amount of people being contacted. In reference to the forms, there was a lot of discussion to find out what agencies do to reach out to the community, so that way they know how they can even get a copy of a citizen complaint form. Is it through their website? Do they have to go into the office? And so part of the survey that will go out will ask that question to try to figure out what agencies do to make sure that communities have those forms accessible to them. If it's through a form, can they do it just verbally? Also, in what types of languages that form is issued in, to make sure that in those communities that might have a high Hispanic population, high Spanish-speaking population, to make sure it's in that type of language or another language that might be predominant in that community. The other portion of this was the policy on those complaints. How are they handled? And so that's part of the data collection survey that will go out as well for those agencies, for every agency, is what do you do with it once you receive the complaint? What is your policy on that? Do you have a policy on that? And then also, this kind of goes to Tim's comment, what data do you have available beyond what is requested? And so that's really an open forum box where if you do collect other data that's beyond what is necessarily required currently, you have an opportunity to express what that other data is. One of the things that we thought was important that was discussed on this subcommittee is when a complaint is filed, there's really 4 legal definitions on what the outcome of that complaint could be: sustained, not sustained, et cetera, founded, unfounded. And so we wanted to make sure that those legal definitions that are defined by law also come out in the RIPA report, so that when people read the report and they're reading about complaints, they'll understand what the context of the outcomes of those complaints are. As we moved in further in our conversation, we talked about the future because we realized that there's a tight timeline on this first report coming out, and we talked about, okay, what's the future of the report going to look like, and can we make some recommendation on additional data and identifying some of those data gaps, which is what Tim was talking about. And then also developing recommendations once we take in the data on what these complaint forms look like, maybe develop some recommendations that can come out from us on a uniform citizen complaint form that captures a lot of information, because one of the discussions that we did have is some agencies do have very detailed citizen complaint forms and others are very basic, where it just nature of complaint and name and date and time. And then just to refer to some of my notes, in a follow-up subsequent phone call, we talked about school age, Sahar and I and Department of Justice, trying to capture what age was the most important on a lot of this data collection. And Sahar brought up a good point that in her community, she has seen stops by police at elementary schools, and so she thought it was important that we made sure we captured that age, and so it was discussed that we should really just capture from school age on to make sure that we knew how that related to the demographics in that community through some type of census data, et cetera. I think that pretty much sums it up. I'll throw it out in case I missed something with the other committee members that were on there.
Yeah, one of the things we also talked about was whether to make sure that the public comment in terms of anecdotal complaints, that be part of the report, so that to make sure that the public's input would be included as part of the report.
Thanks, Dave. That was a great summary. I think we talked about sort of what's realistic for this first report, given the timeline. I'm not sure that we would be at the point, even within the subcommittee, let alone the full board, to sort of recommend a uniform citizen complaint form, let alone process for handling citizen and whatnot. But I wonder if we might be able to, depending on the results we get in surveying folks, be able to recommend what appear to be some best practices, right? And certainly highlight the enormous difference, right? And maybe the data, once we run the data on citizen complaints in terms of rate, both as a rate, a population-based rate, and then, as you point out, contacts, right, or calls to service, or whatever else we use, right, we might see very big discrepancies, right? Similarly sized, similarly situated departments that have enormous disparities, and so it seems like that's something that we could lift up within the report, and then in subsequent reports try to find out, well, what's making that difference, right? What's one department doing particularly effectively that other departments could adopt?
Yeah, and that's a great point, and I know part of the discussion was also that some of us sat on multiple subcommittees, and there are definitely many things that DOJ has identified that kind of overlap in some of those areas, and I think it was good to see that some of the things that we talked about were being talked about in other subcommittees, so make sure that it's covered across all platforms instead of just a narrow platform such as citizen complaints.
I had a couple of questions about the proposed survey. Is the proposal that it will be sent to all law enforcement agencies in California?
Correct.
Okay. And I was thinking, another question is, what does the committee envision as the process for finalizing the survey? Because I was looking through it, and I think there's a lot of good information it's requesting. And I was thinking, since this will, I guess the idea is for the Department of Justice to send it out, that our Division of Law Enforcement, I think, could be very helpful in maybe helping to refine it, given all the partnerships that the Department of Justice or Division of Law Enforcement has with law enforcement in California and other type of surveys and engagement we have. So I don't know if there was further discussion within the committee as how the survey would be finalized.
As far as all of the law enforcement agencies, I think we were realistic that we may not get a response, obviously, from all 700 law enforcement agencies in the state of California. However, if we could at least make sure that follow-up was done with the 8 or 9 agencies that will be part of the, the initial rollout, and then also the agencies that were identified in those zones, the Department of Justice zones. And for those that don't know, the Department of Justice has some zones that they use throughout the state of California that are regions that agencies identify with. So in the Central Valley, we have a Region 5 zone, so the law enforcement agencies in Region 5, and we have a coastal region and a Northern California region. So we thought that that would be an easy way for the Department of Justice to identify agencies in those regions and pick a small agency and a large agency to gather some data. So we were hoping that we could at least get, the initial agencies and those that were identified as small and larger within those zones for this initial data collection to take a look at, to hopefully have some good ideas to at least draw some initial, not necessarily conclusions, but at least some initial ideas from.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Chair, can I elaborate for a second? So the draft survey that was put together mostly on behalf of 2 specific subcommittees, the Citizen Complaint Subcommittee and the State and Local Policies and Accountability Subcommittee, though we do ask one question pertaining to training that would overlap with the post-training subcommittee.
This is a draft survey drafted with questions that were crafted through these subcommittees. And so the process today, this is a survey that will go out from the board. We will distribute it, but it's the board's survey. So it's ultimately up to all of you, the questions that go into this. It's not up to the Department of Justice. You know, we obviously have presence on the board, but it's your survey. And my hope, my hope really is that through the conversation today, we will be able to finalize this so that we are able to send it out and start getting results in. We have, very little time to begin actually looking at these things. So I would like to have this approved today. I was going to add, the universe that we talked about sending it to is the same universe that will be required to submit stop data to us, so that we actually have, right, we're looking at a subset. Ultimately, it's a large subset, but it is nonetheless a subset of agencies that overlap with stop data policies and citizen complaint data, which we will all receive, at some point we'll have all three of those things for all of these agencies.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good idea. I briefly looked at the survey questions in the folder that we got, and I had some duplicates, so I don't know if a page was left out or something like that, but if we could just verify that before we all look at that, and perhaps co-chairs, if we could take that one up later in the day when everybody actually has a chance to look at it. And then I'll add that one of the things we did discuss, and I can't remember if I said it already, so I apologize if I'm repeating, we do know that data is collected in other formats right now, like AB 71, use of force data, and we discussed that in the RIPA report, if that data is already being collected, that there would at least be a reference to it, so that way somebody who maybe had some thoughts on, well, what does this mean in another context, that they could at least go to a link to look at that data that's collected in another area through the Department of Justice.
One of the other things that we also discussed, I'm not sure if you covered it, was to identify all agencies that must be requested. There are several agencies that we identified in that subcommittee that may not be captured in this, and we want to make sure all those, as Shannon pointed out, that all of those agencies are captured.
Correct.
So we've listened to just a couple of the committee reports, and it's really obvious that there's a lot of overlap with the information that can be shared between subcommittees. So for example, we're going to send this survey out, and one of the things we talked about just yesterday on the evidence-based research is having some kind of showcase relative to what's working in California relative to community police relationships. So I'm assuming that all of this information is going to be shared with all of the committees so that they can use it to add value to their discussions.
There's a question in the survey already regarding, do you have a particular initiatives or programs or policies that you have seen are working, and to describe those, and so we can elaborate on that. But ultimately, from the perspective of all of these committees, I think you'll want to explore what do we want to know and capture within the survey, and it certainly is a survey that can serve the purposes of all committees.
Thank you. I think this tool for the board and for everyone, I think what would be helpful process-wise in terms of today, when you get to the point later in your agenda of taking a vote, what would be most helpful is, I think, to get the board's sense as a board whether you want to send out a survey like this to law enforcement, covering the sorts of topics that are in the draft, and then to have, because I don't think it's a good use of everyone's time to try to wordsmith a document like this in a huge group, but to have staff work with the relevant subcommittee chairs to refine the language, and then work with the board to send it out, rather than not wasting, but trying to do wordsmithing of a document. But A, do you want to send out a survey? And B, are these the right sorts of topics that should be included on the survey?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Kelly just said. I think that the value of doing a survey now is to get the baseline information that is going to provide the context for when we start to get the stop data, right? And so this is some of the quantitative and some of the qualitative. There's certainly more that we could do in the future, but given the time frame that we have, I think I strongly suggest that we do indeed send out a survey. And I see that, Shannon, you've done an excellent job in trying to put these pieces together in a single survey. It looks like this document is an overlap of this document, and this one looks like it's just part of this one. So I just want to verify that this is, one is just a visual representation of the other, and that this is the more complete document. This one does seem to be missing some pages.
Yeah, so for content, for just the questions themselves, you'll want to look at the Word document that says draft baseline survey of LEAs, and that was also a document that was put outside for members of the public to review. This is just part of the mock-up from the Survey Gizmo that we've already begun to mock up, so that you can begin to understand visually, where there are a lot of nested questions, right? So if an agency answers no to something, it'll provide a different option than if they answer yes, and so forth, just to give you a sense of that visually. That's the only purpose of that.
That's great. And just to finish my thought on this, it's just baseline information. It's just going to tell us who's got what policies or complaint processes in place, and then that's an opportunity for us to do a deeper dive later. But just knowing initially who has what is going to be really important. And then I do want to also echo what your committee, whatever it was called, the complaint committee, is suggesting, and that is to send this to all applicable law enforcement. Because I think this is the beginning of our relationship and our engagement with law enforcement agencies. And though it's voluntary and we might not get responses from everybody, it is the beginning of what we hope will be an ongoing relationship with law enforcement agencies, building the trust between this body and them to share the information so that we can move forward together.
Chair, would it be helpful to have a motion for discussion, moving to approve the intention of at least what came out of some of the subcommittees to do an initial survey of law enforcement and to work with DOJ to make that survey as inclusive of the kind of information that all 5 subcommittees would like to have.
Only thing that I would add here to Sheriff Robinson, and Tim, you were on the committee, we've discussed this entire citizen complaint committee. I think procedurally we should probably approve the draft minutes that Sheriff Robinson did, so I'd make that motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Motion so carries for approval of the minutes.
And we are going to address the issue of the survey at the end, in general.
You only have to vote on the minutes for the subcommittees on which you're a part, of course.
All right. You guys still awake out there? All right. So I think as we go to our next subcommittee report, that would be our post-training and recruitment report. The other co-chair member, Ali, is not here, so that puts me in the hot seat yet again. But I'll just share briefly and maybe defer also to the judge to really kind of help us, as she really provided some powerful leadership in that discussion. We were having a discussion particularly about the training that Post is supposed to be working in partnership with the Department of Justice by nature of AB 953, specifically focused around the new racial profiling training. You can refer to this in your minutes, which are in your folders, which were angled to do 2 major things, both expose officers to what racial and identity profiling are, how to avoid them, and then equally holding up the procedural justice and implicit bias training that's currently being offered by Post in the Department of Justice that's been created over the last couple years. There were a lot of discussion that we had both with subcommittee members in conversation with Ralph Brown, who joined us from Post, was able to help us really understand kind of what Post is looking at and some of the examples, and they provided a couple abstracts, which you also have in your folder, both around bias-based policing and then also the training and testing specifications for learning domain. So we were having some discussion around what we felt was helpful about that abstract and that outline that was there, and also the things that we felt were not necessarily helpful. I think the judge can speak to some of that. She had a lot of contribution that's listed there, and she can add voice to that. I think before I yield my stand, I'd say some of the things that we noted that we kind of had concerns, certainly around the way that the training was being designed. We also had a lot of concerns around the fact that all police academies and police departments don't train in the same way, don't use all the same material. So we were trying to figure out how could we have a centrality of expectation of all these different departments, considering that they're not necessarily all getting the same kind of training. And so we were trying to kind of figure out what that would look like, and then also came up in our discussion was the fact of where is the money going to come from to focus on implementing this training in law enforcement agencies, recognizing that it does cost to train officers. And so I think there was some discussion we were having around some of the post-budget cuts that have happened, and we were trying to get a budget around what it would really, what was the budget that Post, might be thinking we could be thinking about to implement these different trainings across the state. So that was kind of, I think, and then we had a lot of public comment coming in, really, kind of bringing to light for us as committee members the real importance that they felt that the training that was happening for law enforcement agencies should be really informed by kind of community consciousness and community participation. That certainly came up as a deep part of that. And there was just deep concern around the way in which, and Post did say for us, this was just an abstract, this wasn't their outline, this was something that they were pulling in to kind of look at and use as a starting guide. I felt in our committee, I think others can speak to it, that there seemed to be some invitation around participation with community members, folks from the RIPA board, to try to ensure that we created a curriculum and a content that would certainly provide the kind of understanding that law enforcement agencies needed, and at the same time really be responsive to the concerns that community had with respect to the implementation of AB 953. So I think that was we had a lot of vigorous conversation about that. I'll defer over to the judge, maybe she can share with us, if she's willing, kind of some of the concerns that she voiced there, and maybe give us a context for some of those.
All right, thank you. I had promised I'd get a copy of my comments to the board earlier, but I'm afraid I couldn't do that. Some have been distributed. I think all board members now have it. The points I was making with respect to police training, I think, are points that could be used with respect to any power relationship. And one of the more important power relationships we have in our society is that between the police officer and a member of the community. Members of the public here were not present at our last board meeting, but it was a film. What was shown was a film showing a confrontation, or that's too negative a term, contact between a young black citizen and a white peace officer. And at the end of the film, the young black man said words to the effect that whenever I see a white police officer, I get nervous. And the white peace officer indicated that when he comes into contact with a citizen, he gets nervous. And I thought that film sent the wrong message, because it appeared to be saying that there's an equivalency between the white peace officer and the black young men. That's ridiculous. There's no equivalency, and I think it's a bad idea to try and send that message out. And so that's one of the points I made that have to be taken into account in designing training for peace officers. They have to study power and power balances and imbalances. And there's a fundamental systemic power imbalance that the training has to take into consideration. The course outline also indicated that racism is hate motivated. Well, some people do hate black people or Latinos or women, but the fact of the matter is that racism and sexism and the other intolerances are far more complicated than that, far more complicated. And I felt that the training should take that into consideration. The training used the term terrorism. And of course, we all know what is the first thing that comes to mind when people say terrorism is Muslims. The fact of the matter is that terrorism has run through our history for any number of decades, long before we were a nation state. And I think that that's something that has to be fleshed out, because otherwise it's going to be thought of as something that involves Muslims, and I think that's a big mistake. It's bad enough that we have intolerance now against just one religious group, but to leave people with the message that that's the only terrorism that there is, and that all Muslims are terrorists is something that's got to be, people have to be disabused of those notions. The course outline did not discuss unconscious racism, I thought, enough, and I think that's a serious problem. I think that in the section of the outline that talked about the history of civil rights, it's important to go back beyond, again, the creation of our nation state and start with slavery and peonage and Jim Crow and lynching. And you have to give peace officers a more historical context within which they will learn about racial profiling. Otherwise, it's not going to make a lot of sense to them. Moreover, the statement in the outline that says, quote, "We dismantled the major practice of discrimination," close quote, that statement should be re-examined. The point I made is the signs came off the water fountains, but racism, segregation, discrimination is alive and well, and that point has to be made in any training course. There's another statement in the course outline that indicates that law enforcement was put in a position of enforcing unjust laws. That needs a lot of re-examination also. For one thing, it seems designed to absolve law enforcement of any moral burden regarding injustice. And the point I made was this part of the outline appears to state that the state troopers who beat people with whips and chains on Edmund Pettus Bridge were just doing their duty. Well, that's what the Nazi SS officer said. We mustn't leave that burden with young law enforcement people. You can't tell them that. And you have to explain what you mean with respect to the use of their discretion, with respect to how they contact people of different races and religions. And you have to some extent, or as much as you can in a police training module, you have to make sure that you don't single law enforcement alone as being persons who enforce unjust laws. I mean, that's not fair to law enforcement. The fact of the matter is that businesses, politicians, members of the clergy, teachers, private citizens, and a host of others help prop up an unjust system. And we send officers into communities where people have been oppressed and disregarded and segregated, and we expect them to handle their behaviors. That's ridiculous. And so the point I'm making, and I wouldn't want to turn, post-training into a PhD course, but any discussion of race relations has to acknowledge the wider cultural, political, economic, and historical context within which all racial activities take place. I also noted a section of the course outline that indicated that peace officers have an obligation in preventing and reporting and finding discriminatory practices. The trouble is the minutes don't indicate the completion of the point I was making. I meant, and I'm looking at page 4 of the minutes, the paragraph just above number 5, public comment. The point I made there was that the section of the outline that discusses the obligation of peace officers in preventing and reporting practices that are unjust, my point was by fellow peace officers. That is a hugely important issue in the matter of racial profiling. The obligation of peace officers to report the unjust or illegal activity of other peace officers. And I think we all know what a problem that is. And the only other point I would make with respect to the minutes would be that although we didn't say so in the minutes, we didn't really get around to discussing recruitment, so I'm assuming we'll do that at our next subcommittee meeting. And I hope all of you received a more detailed description of my comments, and if not, I'll see to it that you get it if you want to sign up for that.
Thank you, Judge.
Also, we can update the minutes based on the comment you made. Let me just make sure that, that I understand exactly where it is from you later, and then we can approve them with that revision that she mentioned.
I would move for approval with that change if that's appropriate.
Just a couple comments. Thank you for bringing up the recruitment piece, Judge. I did notice that seemed to be missing in the conversation. I really hope that that's something that the subcommittee will dig into. I guess I would expand it to say recruitment, hiring, and promotions are all part of the same bundle of practices. I know, having been in the DA's office in San Francisco for 12 years, until recently, for instance, the panel of retired officers who did the screening for applicants over that time were, quite adept at screening out applicants of color in particular. And I know that may be one practice that the subcommittee may want to look at, because it's often a practice used, I think, by other departments. So I hope the committee really gets into that. And then, I guess I'm wondering, what is the committee and the board's approach to this whole area? Training is clearly spelled out as something we should be looking at. Post is clearly critical. I found their presentation at the last full board meeting quite disappointing and fairly self-congratulatory about how wonderful their training was in this regard. I'm certainly no expert on police training, but it does seem, and I think you reflected this, Judge, in the minutes, that you can't just have a standalone hour and a half to talk about racial profiling and bias, right? And this may come down to looking at if there are better practices in other states, given the statewide nature of post. So I don't know where you guys are at, but given how critical the training is and what seems to be the content and current approach of host, how do we really dig into that, either as a committee or as a full board?
There were a couple next steps that we did highlight. One of those being, I think we have another subcommittee meeting sometime within the next month, I want to say, where we're going to be meeting for a couple reasons. One of those were to get a deeper draft of some of the training kind of context that they were looking at and really take that to task. And we also, what came out of our meeting was our request for a subject matter expert, particularly around the notions of racial profiling and the history of oppression for people of color and other marginalized groups, to be added in as a part of our committee. That's really helping to shape the training in such a way that the learning construct is much more holistic and much more comprehensive in addressing and helping us think through and helping Post think through with support of the board the way that outline needs to look. So those are a couple of the concrete next steps. I know there was a couple more comments.
Chairman, if I could, please. Getting back to Tim's comments, I had a question, and then I had a point that I wanted to make about Post. One of your points that you just made a moment ago was, in your opinion, it was department's practices to, I don't remember your verbiage per se, to weed out is the word that I'm using. I don't think that's the word you used. Specific African-American candidates within agencies that were applying. That's not what you said.
No, I'm sorry. What I was saying, Mike, was that my experience, which also ended 8 years ago when I was working within the city and county of San Francisco, was that the small screening committee of retired officers, so I'm by no means am I pointing to department policy or department practice, but that approach seemed to result in the screening out of many of the applicants of color, including many that we, folks within law enforcement, on the police commission, within the DA's office, worked hard to recruit because we know how difficult it can be to recruit qualified young candidates of color in particular. And there was example after example. I will tell you, one of the young candidates was an African-American young man from Baby Hunters Point. He was screened out because the screening committee said he did his push-ups wrong. So it was those kinds of anecdotes and experiences that really led to a lot of discouragement on the part of those of us within law enforcement who were trying hard to recruit candidates of color to the department.
Thank you for that clarification. Not speaking on behalf of all of law enforcement, we have 3 other people that are part of law enforcement. That could have been the practice in San Francisco more than 8 years ago. I think the current practice within most agencies throughout the state of California is the original screening process happens within a personnel department, and then the interview process happens within the personnel department of the municipality, and then as it progresses along, there are people from the outside that are brought in also. So I would sure like to hear, not at this forum by any means, to Kelly's point earlier, but I would sure like to know so that we can make sure Post is aware. If somebody's not doing push-ups correctly, we can train them to do push-ups correctly. No matter their ethnic background, that surely should not preclude somebody from being considered in a law enforcement career. And again, speaking from a law enforcement perspective, we are going to be reaching a very tough point in the coming years of recruiting any members into this profession. And we need to work collectively with Post and our agencies within our local municipalities to make sure that we bring in not only as many candidates diversified, but our departments at this point should begin to recruiting above their caps as retirements happen, terminations happen, etc., which dovetails, if I could, Chairman, just one more point into Post, and whether the video was good or bad, we all have different perspective. We need, as this board, as we're identifying now with RIPA being such a large component of something that we all feel is necessary, it will become a fraction of a Post budget. And we can no longer, this entire board, the community members and law enforcement, we can no longer tolerate Post budget being cut or zeroed out, as we have identified so many areas, and now RIPA being just another, that we can no longer have the peace officers' standards and training, which we're all trying to meet, be cut to this significance. And I would implore our chairman that a letter does go to the governor, to the AG, that Post budget is kept intact to the much of the ability. This is so broad ranged in what we're covering under RIPA. So many other pieces of legislation over the last couple of years have identified that needs to be included in Post, but as we saw this year, Post budget was dramatically cut. Thank you very much. Thank you for the clarification, Tim.
And I agree on all your points.
I just want to remind the board that we also period is specifically for reporting out. But, so
We're going to have
we'll
discussion.
have more discussion on all of this after the break and after further public comment. So just to the extent that everybody continues to have lots and lots of thoughts, maybe we continue to move through the reporting out from the other two subcommittees and then, yeah, continue discussion after.
Fantastic. So if folks can record your comments down, then we will certainly have time after the break to revisit those and have some robust conversation. So if we can have a motion from subcommittee members from the, what is the? All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? All right. Motion so carried for the approval of the minutes. Let's go over to our next report out from a committee, which I feel like Dilbert right now with all these pieces of paper in front of me. I'm going to look at your paper. I believe our next subcommittee is our state and local racial and identity profiling policies and accountabilities. We could have a report out from those subcommittee co-chairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our committee was charged to take a look at state and local racial and identity profiling policies. And one of the ways that we want to do it is the same way as, part of the same way as the Citizens Complaint Committee. We want to send out a survey and ask some questions. And I'll just go over some of those questions. Starting out, what do law enforcement agencies throughout the state, what are their current racial identity profiling policies and practices right now? What training do they have to implement those policies? What follow-up procedures do they have to make sure that the policies are in fact working? If violations of the policy take place, what happens after that? Is there retraining? Is there discipline? And then also, something that we felt was very, very important, do the agencies, as part of their policies, do they have a risk management system or an early warning system in place? So when you see things start to happen, maybe you have the opportunity to nip them in the bud before they get worse. And also, we felt it was important to get a baseline to survey the agencies throughout California. So once we got the survey, we could take a look at the policies, see if there were some similarities in the policies throughout the state, some commonalities, what were the good things, what were the bad things, and then also take a look at the policies and see if they related to or they were similar to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, their model policy, or the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, see how they meet up or marry up to those type of policies. So that's what's kind of our focus. We were the same group of law enforcement agencies to survey to get a baseline, and then move forward from there once we got that and the analysis was done. Make some recommendations going forward. And my co-chair was Andrew. And Andrew, is there something you want to add?
Thank you, Commissioner Stanley. I would just add that, again, this is, given the time that we have, this is what we thought could be done for this first report, which was January 1st, and that is to just get, initial understanding of who has what policies, not just specific racial and identity profiling policies, but the related policies, some of which you just described, early warning systems, body-worn cameras, prevention of bias policing, et cetera. And then in the subsequent year, we can go deeper, we can analyze those things. So this is just a first pass, and I think it's a good baseline set of information.
Just two things I want to add. I want to thank Shannon and her staff for putting together the mock-up of the survey and putting our information together. It was very good to sit down and take a look at it and kind of see how it would look maybe going out here in the near future. So I wanted to thank you and your staff for that. And also related to the racial profiling and identity policies. We thought one of the questions we felt that we should ask is, does the department have some type of recurring ethical or professionalism training that's ongoing that would relate to the racial profiling training? We thought it was very important to have some kind of ethical training. So that was our focus of our meeting.
I have just one comment. It's more of a question, not necessarily a suggestion at this point, but when we developed these committees, we just did our best effort to figure out, what lane each committee should be focusing on. And I'm just hearing out on this report and also the citizen complaints report, have we moved to a place that maybe those two committees would work more effectively as one rather than two? That's a question, I guess, for members of both committees, because they're both doing very similar things. They're both going to be conducting, there's a survey that's going to address both of their needs. And I think, well-intended, we started with as many committees as we thought, but it's just a question to those other two committees is whether or not they would be more effective working in unison.
All right, considering we're going to hold our questions for these last two report outs for our discussion after public comment coming back from the break, let's move to and there also are no minutes there's no minutes to approve. Do we have any written minutes?
There.
Oh, there are minutes. Okay, can someone put a motion for it?
Motion.
Second? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, motion so carry, approval of those minutes. Our final subcommittee before break will be our evidence-based research and best practices. Can we have a report out from the subcommittee co-chairs?
Oscar Bobrell, who's sitting right next to me. And so we are co-chairs of the evidence-based research subcommittee, and there are two goals that we have. The first is to distill academic findings on the most effective trainings, policies, and practices to reduce profiling. And then the second is to develop recommendations and best practices based on those academic findings. So we met as a group just yesterday and discussed the possibility of a series of deliverables that we would put in place for the year or work on over the year of 2018. And so there are 7 of these deliverables, and so I thought I would just kind of name them and go through a short description of each. And the first one is a stop data report repository. And the idea there is to curate a collection of stop data reports from diverse law enforcement agencies from across the country, but with a focus on the state of California. And then to write user-friendly summaries of each report, and to review the methodological strengths, and to create menus to help people to navigate the information. And so this would be an electronic repository that people could navigate easily is the idea. The second deliverable was a training and solutions repository. And here, the idea is to curate a collection of trainings and resources and best practices for improving police-community relations, and to offer some assessment on, how those, trainings, how effective those trainings are, how they're being evaluated, if they're being evaluated, and so forth. Here, we'd also like to educate the stakeholders on the values of evidence-based solutions, and so there would be a focus on that. So we have 2 repositories, and then we also have 3 tutorials that are also electronic. The first is a tutorial on how to write a stop data report, and so this is aimed at law enforcement agencies, and the idea here is to design an interactive, e-tutorial that would illustrate, how to collect, analyze, interpret, and present stop data. The second tutorial is on how to read a stop data report, and so this is directed at the public, and again, it would be another interactive tool on how engaged, sort of how to sort of read these reports critically and be a critical consumer, I guess, of this, and how to, like, defining terms and some instruction on how to interpret the data and so forth. And then the third tutorial is how to write a stop data report, or how to write about a stop data report, and that would be geared towards the media. And again, another e-tutorial for the media this time on how to cover stop data reports and how to sort of critically interpret the findings and so forth. So we have 2 repositories, 3 tutorials. We also, as a deliverable, put on the table this researcher practitioner partnership guide. And this is a guide on how to develop effective partnerships between researchers and law enforcement practitioners. And here, the idea too would be to highlight cases of existing partnerships that seem to work, successful collaborations, to also recommend infrastructure requirements for putting these relationships into place. And then last, we had this idea of a implementation showcase, and here the idea would be to identify an agency that has put the stop data report findings to work in some way, and I mean by to work in terms of reducing racial disparities. And so the idea here is that would be ongoing, and so we would have on a regular basis kind of look across the state and sort of pick out agencies that seem to be using that data in an effective way, and to offer some coverage of that or some story of that would go out to the public. So those are the 7 deliverables, the 2 repositories, the 3 tutorials, the researcher practitioner partnership guide, and then this implementation showcase. And again, we can't do all this, obviously, but in time for the report coming up in January of 2018. So the idea would be to kind of mark that or list that in the initial report, and then we would work on delivering all of these items over the course of 2018, and the result of that would go in the report for January of 2019. So I think I covered most of what we talked about. So, did you want to add? Okay. All right. I'm sorry.
Any other contribution from subcommittee members from the evidence-based research and best practices? All right. Do we actively have minutes that folks are able to review? These are out, so can we get a motion?
I'll make the motion.
Can we get a second? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, motion so carried. All right, we made it through all of our subcommittee reports. Where I'm from, somebody has to say amen, but we won't do that to y'all here. So what we will do is we're getting ready to take a break. We do want to encourage all of those from the public to please come back after break. We're going to actually start off with public comment, hopefully informed by what you have heard, certainly in this first half of the RIPA meeting, and certainly your perspectives and or opinion stories that you want to put in the minds and ears of us as board members before we go into our final board discussion after your public comment period. So we're going to take a break for about 30 minutes. I believe we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is a good thing. So let's go ahead and take 30 minutes and try to reconvene. We'll certainly have a hard start time of 12:45, so as much as we can, let's be back in the room between 12:40, 12:45. We'll be beginning with public comment. Thank you.